You are freer than you think.
Is like the ultimate form of freedom.
You expound upon that freedom to develop on this planet.
True freedom comes from within. It's the ability.
Thinking to myself, I can help you or I can destroy you.
Man, as a 2-time felon,
I work really hard, and I've been a life learner.
When things are feeling tough, let yourself be surprised.
The world favors risk-taking.
Welcome to the Freedom Pact. Hey, Freedom Pact, and welcome back to episode 80. I am your host, Joseph Newton, and I am delighted to bring you today's episode with a man that I greatly admire, Shane Parrish. Shane is the host of the Knowledge Project podcast, which is my personal go-to listen, and for a slight tangent, I think that Shane is one of the best interviewers around, and he is someone that I have personally taken a lot of notes from as an interviewer. Shane has interviewed the likes of Jim Collins, Esther Perel, Daniel Kahneman. There's also been some mutual guests like Robert Greene and Annie Duke. The Knowledge Project is just one of the notches under Shane's hugely impressive umbrella. Shane is also the founder of Farnham Street, an online learning community, while Shane founded whilst working for a leading intelligence agency in Canada. Farnham Street can be found at fs.blog, and I promise you will not regret checking that out. Farnham Street is dedicated to mastering the best of what other people have already figured out. That site now gets over 1 million page views per month. Shane, as you may have guessed, is an absolute learning machine. So much so that I have made it one of my personal life goals to go and see this guy's bookshelf with my own eyes. And to emphasize this point, Shane told me that in 2013 he read 153 books in 1 year. Shane is my North Star when it comes to education, and speaking to him has made me want to improve, and I'm sure that you guys are going to take so much out of this conversation. When Shane isn't interviewing leading scholars and notable people, you may find him managing Cirrus Partners, which is an investment company operating out of North America. Farnham Street, Shane's project, also released a book called The Great Mental Models, which covers general thinking concepts. Shane and I discuss Volume 1 in today's episode, which is all around general thinking concepts. Now, you may be thinking, why is this important? Why are mental models important? Well, as the saying goes, to the man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Having a clear and concise understanding of these mental models will greatly improve your decision making. And when you consider that your life, who you are right now, where you are, the money you make, your health, all these other things, this is the conclusion of the vast amounts of decisions which we make every day. Becoming a better decision maker will ultimately make for a much better life. So without any further ado, I hope you enjoy this conversation with the remarkable Shane Parrish. Shane, so great to connect. Man, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
It's such a pleasure. So, usually towards the end of the Freedom Pact interview, Shane, I always ask the guests for some book recommendations. I've pretty much listened to every single interview I could find Shane Parrish in online. And what I found particularly interesting about you, Shane, is that you give a great quote in one interview, and you said, "There's no real point in me just offering your audience, 10 books that I can offer. But what I can offer you are the underlying philosophies as to what I follow to select a book." So yeah. I actually think that this may, in fact, alter the questions which we ask at the end of the show. So I'd love to know, what is your process for selecting a book? What are the philosophies?
Well, I mean, one of them is what's going on in my life right now. So what's contextual? Do I need to learn something? Am I going through something personally that I want to learn about? Are there areas that I'm just curious about that I don't know a lot about? And then that gives me sort of like a direction. And then it's about finding a book within that direction. And a lot of that is just sort of like happenstance. Some of it's Amazon and searching reviews. I mean, I try at least to consume start a lot of books, but I don't finish a lot of books. So I want to sort of read widely and promiscuously, if you will, and then sort of like deep dive on a few of them. But you get a feel for a book. And sometimes it's just like, I don't want this book right now, but I want to come back to it. Now I know about it. And sometimes you need the context to actually have the book have meaning for you. So an example for me is like Marcus Aurelius and Meditations, right? I hated that book when I read it in university. And then I went back to it when I got divorced, and it had this different context all of a sudden, right? Because of what was going on in my life. And now I was like, oh, I didn't think it was life changing in that sense, but it resonated with me on a whole nother level that it never did in university. And so life experiences constantly change which books are going to impact you. That's why it's so hard to give somebody a book. And we also think societally, like when you give somebody a book, it's a signal. And we're starting to see that now with titles, right? You Are a Badass. That's a title of a best-selling book. It almost doesn't matter what's in that book because people just want to give it to somebody as a signal that they think you're a badass. So I tend to stay away from sort of like the popular stuff that is like whatever. We did a study a couple years ago about what's on the New York Times best-selling list. And we went back all the way to 2000 and we recreated every list. So 52 weeks a year since 2000, came up with every title. And then just sort of like what's still in print that was best-selling 20 years ago. And most of it's not. And so one of the heuristics I use is like what's still in print today that's over 20 years old? What are those books, right? And then is there a truth in those books that becomes a universal truth? And I think for most of them, there's a lot of philosophy books, but there's a lot of sort of like The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People would be an example of a book that has stood the test of time. You read that book and it's, it was also written, I'm sure, in the 60s, and it'll be written again, and because it's talking about something timeless. And I love the idea of timeless things because they don't expire, and I can build on my knowledge instead of just sort of acquiring this knowledge that has a half-life of a few weeks. And so there's no sort of like concrete system I have for like how I pick what I read, but those are some of the variables that I think about when I'm choosing something to read.
Yeah, I find that really interesting. And as you were saying there, for some reason, the book which was coming to my mind was Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. I mean, that book was written in like, was it like the 30s or something?
Yeah.
So the other thing as well, Shane, that I really found interesting when I was listening to you, I will admit that my whole reading philosophy had all been about quantity to such an extent that I feel as if my identity, my ego had almost become tied up in Goodreads challenges and how big can I build my bookshelf. But
I went down this, sorry, just for a second, I went down this path, and I think it was 2013 or 2014. I read 153 books that year, cover to cover. And then I just sort of like woke up and I was like, what am I doing? Right? Like, and now I'm just reading to read. It's not like I'm reading to actually like check the box instead of reading to learn. And I think there's a huge difference between the two things, right? Like when you're doing that, it's an ego thing. It's a signal thing. It's like, but it's not a learning thing. And ultimately, like the outcome I want is sort of like learning, connection, meaning, timeless sort of content that I can build upon or get a different angle into.
I finished the Great Mental Models yesterday. I picked up the Kindle version of it. We will talk about this throughout the interview. But was this the first book in which you've published?
This is the first book we've published. It's been a process, that's for sure.
Yeah. And what I found really interesting is as I was reading the book, the content is great. I love the content. But what I was so taken aback by was that you went through all these parables. You included all these historical, a litany of historical context. So much so to the point I was thinking to myself, I was like, wow, this is giving me real. The only way I think I could put it is real Robert Greene type vibes. So I'd love to know, who were some of your influences in terms of, from an author standpoint, who were some of the people that impacted your writing style, Shane?
I mean, that's a good question. I think a lot of people have sort of, there's a lot of people I admire, but I don't necessarily want to be like them, right? And I think, Ryan Holiday is a really good writer for his style, and James Clear and Robert Greene and Adam Grant and all of these people. I think part of my process is I don't want to mimic anybody else. So I'm careful when I'm reading not to try to read into too much of style. Now, there's people that do things better than you that you can learn from, and that's a different sort of thing. But I don't think I want to copy anybody else's style. Every time I've tried to do that, it always ends up being really difficult and really hard and not natural. And even though I might like that style, it might not be me. And I think with some of the people I had mentioned, it's the same thing, right? I like also short and pithy and making people think, and that's a different style than writing a book, right? So it's what medium are you on, and what style suits the medium, and what can you do to tailor? And mediums are different too, right? Because you think of social media as a medium, but the way you tailor a message to somebody on LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram or Twitter is all going to be different, because they all have different primary consumers. And so you have to think about what is the method of communication, because what are you going for? You're going to resonate with somebody. You want to create meaning. You want to help them see something they haven't seen before, or understand something in a way that they haven't understood it before. And part of the way you do that is approaching them in a way that is accessible, right? Meeting them where they are. And how you do that is tailored to a medium. If you sit down and pick up a book, it's one thing. And if you if you're sort of consuming things online, it's different. And one of the things we've learned through publishing this book is, as interesting as this sounds, is we wanted to make it. We have 5 books coming out. We're trying to cover basically the big ideas of the world that you would have learned in the 101 class of university. We call them the Great Middle Models. It's a multidisciplinary education. And we didn't want to make them longer than necessary, right? Because I hate books that are 300 pages that should have been 150 pages or 50 pages. And so we made the first book, and we included sort of the general thinking concepts in it. And one of the feedback that we're getting is the book is short. And it's oh, that's really interesting, right? Because for us, it felt the right length. And I think that that's another thing too, right? Is you can't please everybody all of the time, right? And the style of that book is going to be different from the style of that series, I should say, is going to be different from the style of some of the other stuff that we produce. And it's sort of matching the style to something true and genuine to Reed and to me personally, but also being adaptable to what we're trying to accomplish with the books, right? This is a series of reference books. The style for that will be different than if we try to, or if I attempt to write a more popular book, or sort of a more widely available book, instead of this cult underground sort of knowledge-based reference book.
Yeah, it's really interesting. When I was going through the book, what I really found was just how enjoyable it was to read. I think that those historical references, I really was taken back by, I would just say, what is, I would say in general, quite a complex topic. I mean, you're trying to distill, vast amounts of hugely complex information. And I was reading on Kindle, and I got to, and on the Kindle it gives a percentage of how far through you are, and I was on 9%. And I looked again, I was I'm on 43%. I was this is a real fun read.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm so happy to hear that. I mean, it's gratifying that you can make a reference book interesting, right? And, we tried our best to also make it a bit boring, if you will, right? Which is, the title isn't sexy. There's no sort of like sex appeal to the book. It's basically like you have to be interested in learning about these big ideas to pick up the book to begin with. And then how do we engage you in those big ideas? And the physical version, I mean, again, tailoring sort of like things to the medium, it's like, how do you pull people in? The audio is sort of the worst way to consume a reference book. So that's really difficult. But the Kindle book, we actually tried and we did different things than we've seen other Kindle books do. And the physical book is actually this beautiful sort of like integration between design and illustration, and it's trying to like pull you into the book itself.
Yeah. What I also love about you, I mean, you mentioned that book, You Are a Badass, and you mentioned, the pop psychology books, and I think it could be so easy, especially, with the major platform you've built. You could have just done a typical, success principle type book, or you could have done something like this, which will sell numerous copies. But I feel as if what you've done is you've appealed to a real, maybe the smallest viable audience type thing as Seth Godin, and then you get people like me and obviously your crowd, which they just absolutely love it. It delights them.
Yeah, I mean, like I don't think we put that much thought into it. We just really wanted to give back into the world. I mean, my background was sort of working for an intelligence agency, and one of the things that I needed to get better at was I had a computer science degree, and while that helped me solve a lot of problems, I mean, it also ran its course. And then I found out I didn't really know much about psychology, and how can you manage people if you don't know about psychology? And I didn't really know a lot about biology, and I didn't really know a lot about all these other subjects. And you think, oh, that's not relevant to what you're doing. And, it's not until it is, right? And I think like having a system to think through problems with these sort of truths and timeless truths or invariant ideas in mind gives you a better framework for solving problems. And I mean, I can't go into details, but the amount of times we use biology to solve computer science problems would blow your mind. And it's just a basic knowledge of biology that would help you sort of understand things. And it's like, oh, that's really interesting. And it allows you to solve problems in a very creative way. And so our goal is to give that information to the world for free. You can buy the books and support the project. When all 5 books are done, we will at some point make all the content freely available online, because part of what we're trying to do at Farnham Street is equalize opportunity, not necessarily outcomes, but definitely giving people all over the world the same opportunity to access high quality, multidisciplinary thinking. And that's what we try to do with the podcast too, the Knowledge Project. We just try to get the best guests we can and like pick their brains and deep dive onto certain subjects.
Let's delve into this link between where you were back in 2001 and that transitionary phase that you had between going from that job at that intelligence agency and then your journey, choosing that MBA which you went on, and then stumbling along the likes of
I mean, like the gist of it is basically like I started work 2 weeks before September 11th. The world changed forever September 11th, especially if you worked in an intelligence agency. For the next 7 to 8 years, I worked 6 to 7 days a week, probably 8 to 12 hours a day. There wasn't a lot of time for vacation. You ended up doing things you weren't qualified to do, right? Just timing, circumstance, not because you get a lot of promotions, but it's not because you deserve them. Right? It's because you're the warm body in the seat, and next man up, we need to sort of do this. And not only is your country counting on you, but the world in some ways is counting on you. And so you end up doing these things that you just really have no idea how to do. And so my computer science degree, as time went on, became less and less relevant to the problems I was dealing with when I was managing a team or people or managing managers. And I think I got to a point where, when I was managing operations, that I owed it to people. I felt like I wasn't thinking through problems very clearly, right? And I felt like I was missing something, and I felt like the citizens of Canada who had placed their trust in me sort of deserved better in a way, right? Like I wasn't very confident in the decisions I was making. And luckily, I think overall I made pretty good decisions, but I felt like I didn't know enough to be making the decisions that I was making. And so I went on this journey, this internal journey to like, man, what am I missing? And, it starts at work where you start asking people like, how would you decide this? Like, what's going on? Like, I remember going into my boss's office one day, I think it was like 2007. And I said like, hey, this happened last night and I made this decision. And he's like, oh, that's fine. That's the correct decision. And I'm like, how do you know it's the correct decision? Like, how would you think about that? And like his level of thinking was the same as mine. And I was like, if I feel my level of thinking is superficial, like I need more, right? Like, and I said, I don't think I know what I'm doing. And he just laughed at me and said, nobody knows what they're doing. We're just doing our best. And I was like, I understand that and I get that. And that message, has an appeal to me because it sort of absolves me from responsibility. But I also had this side of me having parents in the military and lives at stake and all of this where I can do better and I can do more. And so I went on this process internally to learn about making decisions. How does the organization make them? How does the government make them? What are the variables that I need to be thinking about? And, I didn't learn the stuff that I was wanting to learn for whatever reason. And then I went outside of work. I did my MBA, tried to get a broader view of the world. And I felt like the MBA wasn't really the education that I was hoping it to be. And I also, that would have been hard because I had a very nostalgic view of sort of my undergrad, which I loved, and then going to an MBA, which I didn't necessarily love. But I wasn't learning the things that I wanted to do, right? Like I wasn't learning how the world connects. I'm learning these very desperate subjects and not how one affects the other, right? Like how can you manage people if you don't understand the basics of psychology? How can you make decisions about operations if you don't understand probabilistic thinking, second order thinking? How can you get better if you're not constantly updating based on the feedback, what's happening in your brain, right? You have a view of how this world works and you're expecting a certain outcome. And so you put those ideas into practice. And then what happens is a lot of people don't update based on feedback. Now, on a one-off basis, you might not want to update because it might just be a probabilistic thing, right? If something's going to happen 90% of the time, 10% of the time, it's not going to happen. But if you're making similar decisions over and over again, you're getting feedback. It's like, well, I'm expecting a 90% success rate, but I'm getting a 15% success rate. And the common thing that I noticed, and I think we all do it, and we all have this tendency, is to just absolve ourselves from those decisions, right? We blame others, we blame the circumstance, we sort of like, it's too much of a hit to our ego or our worldview to update it, but it's like, no, I need to update those things. Like, where are those things? Because those are the things that are going to make me better at those types of decisions. Those are the things that the citizens deserve that I'm thinking about while I'm making these decisions. And so at the end of the day, I went on this journey. I found Charlie Munger through my MBA program. Somebody actually quit the MBA program while I was doing it, and I ran into him in the cafeteria, and I was like, you always thought about problems differently, like where did this come from? And he said, hey, there's this guy, Charlie Munger. And I mean, it just sort of like set me on this journey. And I think that very night, I looked up Charlie Munger, and my life changed, right? I was like, here's a guy, like this I get. I don't understand half the stuff he's talking about, but I understand the way that he's connecting ideas from different subjects, and that's what I've been looking for, and that's what I want to gravitate to. And I really just, I wouldn't say I quit my MBA on that day, but I mean, I stopped doing homework and, skipped a lot of classes and just sort of like deep dove on Charlie Munger and trying to learn a little bit about that. And then I went back to work and sort of rose up the ranks a bit more and, decided it wasn't for me.
One of the things that the book really makes evident is that we're always making decisions, right? Whether that's consciously or unconsciously. So if you could just give some context into mental models, could you just discuss why they're so important?
Well, so we all sort of like have these ideas of how we think the world works. And we have maps of what those models are in our head, right? Like if I hold up a pen right now and I tell you I'm going to drop it, you know what's going to happen because you've conceptualized gravity. You don't have to remember it at a a level where you know all the details, like it falls at 9.8 meters per second squared, you get the gist of it. Your brain has this sort of like ability to predict how the world's going to work. And there's other mental models we have are based on like our values, right? So I generally trust other people, so I see them as trustworthy. I feel like I'm a trustworthy person, therefore I project that other people will be trustworthy, right? So we also have value-based mental models that shape how we see other people in situations. And some of those models, I mean, we have millions of these models if you want to think about it in our head, or thousands, hundreds of thousands probably. And a lot of them help us think better, and we're not conscious of them. And a lot of them need to be updated. They're just incorrect. And that comes back to like, how do we update those models when the feedback comes in that they're not working, they're not serving us, we have the wrong map. One of the stories that, you know, where this happened to me was I was doing my exams, I think it was first year university, and I just wrote down the wrong exam schedule. So I showed up for my psychology test to find out, having studied for it and prepared for it, to find out it was physics. And so no amount of extra work or no amount of better attitude would have made that better. And most of the common sort of like wisdom or folklore in the world or self-help books are directed at sort of like, you just need to work more effectively or have a better attitude. And it's like, well, if you have the wrong understanding of how the world works, neither of those things are going to happen. And in this case, my map, if you will, was just the wrong exam schedule. It'd be like driving in a city, right? Like if I put you in London, England, and give you a map of New York and told you to get somewhere, like no amount of effort is going to make that possible. And so we have to sort of like conceptualize where these maps are and where are blind spots. And for me, I think one of the big things that stood out to me was the blind spots are, I don't know about all of these other subjects that have been around for hundreds and thousands of years. And how can I make decisions in an interconnected world if I don't know about them, right? So if you want to like tagline for it, it's mental models are how we understand the world, right? They shape how we think, but they also shape the connections we see between variables, right? They also shape what we ignore in a situation. So they simplify complexity, but they're also why we think some things are more relevant than others. They're also how we reason to ourselves, right? We pick this model is probably going to carry the most weight in this particular decision. And that's how we think at an unconscious level in a non-scientific sort of, I'm not talking about how the brain interacts with itself, but that's sort of like how we do it. And if you ask people how they think, it's really hard to explain. But if you say like, walk me through this situation, you'll learn what models that they're using based on the variables they mention. And those models that they're unconsciously using also have these interconnections. And so we want to play that out over time, and that we're making a prediction. Every decision is a prediction about the future. And sometimes you can have more certainty and sometimes you have less, but you need to come to a conclusion that allows you to make a decision that you have at least a little bit of confidence in or avoid negative outcomes, right? Which is like, I really don't know what is going to lead us to the best possible decision, but I know here's a swath of things that are going to lead us to really bad outcomes. So if you just avoid the bad outcomes, you're going to get to better outcomes. But all of that comes through sort of thinking better, right? And the more models you have in your head, the fewer blind spots you have. And if you have no blind spots, which is like, we're never going to reach there. It's the pursuit of sort of knowledge. But if we ever got to a point where you didn't have blind spots, you would just always know what to do with a perfect degree of accuracy, right? But it doesn't happen that way. And the world is more like poker in a way where, even you can get your hand and play it perfectly. You can play your hand perfectly, and you can still come up with a bad outcome. And that happens sometimes.
To the man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail, which is true. And then I suppose in terms of the mental models, you could essentially, I think you could break them down into the psychological ones and then the heuristics.
Yeah, I mean, there's different. They're all sort of heuristics in a way, right? And some of them are better than others. You have sort of like the models from the world, which is like math and like physics and unchanging invariant ideas, and then you have models that are based on your values, which is sort of like internalizing, here's how I see other people, because in a lot of ways this is how I see myself. And then we default to seeing things in other people that we sort of like see in ourselves.
It's so interesting because I recently was meeting with one of my good friends, and at the time he was in a relationship. He'd been in it for perhaps 5 years. I think about 5 years at that point. And we hadn't really spoken for a little while. So I just said to him, I said, like, how's it going in your relationship? How's things? And he said to me, he said, I'm miserable every day. He said, I'm so unhappy. He said, I haven't been happy for ages. So I said, well, why don't you just end it? And he goes, well, he said, I've just invested all this. He said, I've invested so much of my time, my money. He said, and I said, this is the sunk cost bias. I said, your brain is imagining all the things in which you've invested. And he said, I know it's the exact bias. So I said to him, I said, the other thing to consider, I said, is the opportunity cost. I said, because whilst you are in this relationship which is making you unhappy, you're also missing the opportunity of potentially finding another partner which could make you happy. So that's an example there of just two of those mental models which impact our everyday life, right?
Yeah, so I think those are two specific ones that I think are really interesting, right? Opportunity cost is a mental model and I think they're different mental models, right? So opportunity cost comes from sort of life, but if you want to think of it, economics, and sort of sunk cost is a mental fallacy that we make, right? So in thinking. And the thing with cognitive biases are they're really good at explaining why we made a mistake. They're really bad at helping us avoid those mistakes, right? So we have the godfather, if you will, of cognitive biases, Daniel Kahneman, who was on our podcast a couple of weeks ago.
Awesome episode.
Right? But one of the things that he said that's really interesting in that conversation, and he said it before, right, is I've studied these things my whole life. I've studied cognitive biases, and I feel like I'm no better at them than anybody else. And that's really interesting to me, not in a negative way, but in a way like, how is it that this person has studied this? So maybe they're really good at explaining why we make mistakes, and they're really bad at helping us avoid them. And then you have these two guys from Omaha, Nebraska, like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, and they don't talk a ton about cognitive biases. They talk about human misjudgments, but they seem to have come up with a system that allows them to avoid these problems in advance. And one of the ways that they do that is they think about the world as an interconnected entity. And so opportunity cost becomes a really interesting way to think about things, right? And people don't tend to think this way by default, but if you're saying yes to something, you might not be saying no to something else, but you're sort of like freeing, you're preventing yourself from the optionality of saying no to something else. And if you think about life, your goal should be to constantly raise your opportunity cost. Problem is most people don't have an opportunity cost. One way to change that is just simply apply minimum wage to every hour of your day. Right? So if I'm commuting, well, that means I'm not doing something else. I'm not spending time with my family. I'm not spending time with my friends. I'm not learning something. I'm not doing all these other things. And of course, you can argue that you can listen to podcasts in the car and make it productive. I don't agree that every hour of the day should be super productive. But the point remains that everything has a cost associated with it. And we worked this out with a buddy of mine because I live downtown and he lives in a suburb. And I said it was cheaper to live downtown. And he said, there's no way it's cheaper to live downtown. And I said, well, let's just factor in the fact that you're in a car for 90 minutes to 2 hours a day. So not only is your housing is less expensive because you live farther out, but you're putting more wear and tear on the roads, you're polluting more, you're sort of like consumed, you're sitting in this car and you think none of those things really have this cost associated with them, except for gas, which is really subsidized. But what if we apply minimum wage to those 2 hours a day, every day, after tax? And we assume that. And then all of a sudden it's like, you know what? They're pretty equal. And it was like, that was eye-opening for him, because I was like, well, my commute's 5 minutes and yours is, 2 hours. And how do we don't tend to, and economics opportunity cost is one way to think about it, but there's opportunity cost, and I could be spending that with my partner, I could be spending it with my kids, I could be spending that with my family, I could be spending it doing the things that are actually meaningful. And if you think about life backwards, like inversion, right? Like living life with the end in mind, it's like, where do you want to go? And the things you're going to remember when you're 90 are the people, and they're the memories. They're not going to be like, I spent 20 years of my life in a car commuting. And now, not everybody can afford to do that, but those are sort of like some of the ways that you can use mental models to think through problems from a different lens. And that's all it is, right? It's giving you a lens into the situation. It's not telling you how to decide, because there's other ways to view that situation, right? Which is like, I might want to retire by the time I'm 40, so I'm willing to do this and live in the suburbs, and I'm making a trade-off. And it's just, how do we surface the trade-offs we're making? How do we surface the blind spot? How do we walk around a problem in a three-dimensional way and try to get the best view into it that we can get, so when we're making decisions, we have an idea of we have an actual understanding, so it becomes fairly reasonable or obvious what to do.
The one question which we get all the time, and I remember I asked Annie Duke, who I think was also a guest on the Knowledge Project.
Annie's phenomenal. I love her.
Yeah, and I remember I asked her and on the show, and she didn't have an answer for it. So I wonder if you have one.
If she doesn't have an answer, I probably will.
And I said to her, because she came on to discuss her book, Thinking Like Bets, and the question which we get a lot is, how can we avoid instant gratification, right? Is how can we become conscious of exactly what we're doing? So, it's like the don't eat the marshmallow, right? So I wonder, how would you approach a topic like, let's say, instant gratification? Because I know this is highly relevant to our audience.
I think it's going to be different for different people. And I'm going to preface this with, I don't have a good answer that works for everybody. I have an answer that works for me. And that what works for me is, I'm lucky enough to be in a position where I don't have to do something immediate to sort of like pay for my food, or all these things, that I'm not driven by the next moment, right? And I think for a lot of people, we're not driven by the next moment. And then that allows you to operate with a different time scale than other people. And I think keeping that time scale in mind is sort of the essence of life, right? You want to do things in the moment that are meaningful when you're 90. The flip side of that is, like, you don't want to optimize for the moment. Like, if you optimize for the shortest life, like if you think you have 8 hours to live, you're going to go out and we think we'll spend money, but we won't, or sort of like do all these things, but that's not a way to live. So you have to, and I wouldn't say balance. It's just sort of like, what kind of life do you want to live? And if you think of competition, like in a biological sense, or competition in terms of contrast in a chemical thermodynamic sense, what gives you an advantage over other people? And one of the things that we've found is a sustainable advantage, because I don't think it'll ever be fully taken away, is timelines, right? It's just time. How people think about time differently. Some people want to optimize for the next quarter. Some people want to optimize for the next 10 years. Some people want to optimize for the rest of their life. And those things affect the projects you take. They affect your motivation to work. They affect a whole bunch of things. But everybody's
Sorry,
working.
can I just jump in there?
Yeah.
What is it that you specifically look to optimize? What is your sort of time process for what, is it a quarter? Is it a year? Is it 10 years?
Well, it's changed, right? So like when I was in my early 20s, I was optimizing for, I want to have financial independence as quickly as possible. Why do I want that? Because I don't want other people to have any power over me. I don't want to have to be beholden to a job. I don't want to have to be. And then when I got that, or reasonably got that, then it changed, right? And then it's sort of like, I've also matured in a lot of ways. I don't know if, knowing what I know now, if I would go back and optimize for the same things. And now it's more like, I want to optimize for being a great father to my kids. I want to be a great partner to the person I end up with. I want to spend my life in a way that I don't have regrets when I'm 90 about the things that I think will be meaningful to me when I'm 90. And I think that enables me to just, I don't need to do the things that other people are doing. And I don't feel a pull to it because I know the direction that I want to go in. So I don't have to copy, and I can do projects where there's no payoff for 5 years. And it's not a big deal because we put ourselves in a situation where financially we can handle that. And the flip side of that is like, it just enables us to do things that are completely different from what other people are going to do. Because how much competition are you going to have if you're willing to suffer for 5 years before you get a potential payoff? Almost zero. How much competition are you going to have if you're willing to suffer for 10 years before you get this payoff? Almost zero. How much competition are you going to have if you do the same thing for a year? Almost zero, right? And this timeline becomes this sort of like competitive. Now, are we right? We don't know. We won't know for 5 years for some of the projects that we have going on. Flip side of that is like, we know nobody's going to copy us, right? Or we have this strong sense of nobody's willing to endure as much trial and error and hardship and sort of like eating glass is what we call it for a long period of time just to get better at what we're doing. And that affords us the opportunity to do things differently. And I think like if you do things like everybody else is doing them, you're going to get the same results everybody else gets. But doing things differently doesn't guarantee you better results. It just means you're not going to get the same results everybody else gets. So you have to do things differently. But you have to advantageously diverge from the herd, right? When do I want to copy other people? When do I want to be different? Which sort of spectrum do I think that I'm going to land on? And then you have to be willing to look like an idiot. And most people, aren't willing to look like an idiot, right? And I think that that's probably one of the biggest things that prevents us from pursuing our dreams. Is like we know what we want to do, but it'll stand out. And, in a lot of ways, we're taught our whole life not to stand out, right? The nail that sticks up gets hit. A person who looks different, the way that they're approaching something gets pointed out or made fun of, and if it fails, you sort of like, increasingly almost get ridiculed for some of you should have known better. No, man, like this is biology, right? We want this sort of like, we call it a copying error in DNA when evolution does it, and it naturally just tests things all the time. But when people do it and they fail, it's like this terrible thing. And when they succeed, they were just lucky. And it's like, no, they were experimenting. They were doing something different. Whether it was consciously or not is less relevant to the fact that we need those sort of experiments happening in life. And you need to think about the experiments you have in your life. Where are you doing something that's different from other people? Where are you consciously choosing to take a different approach, and why are you doing that? What sort of feedback are you getting on that approach? And like, can you adapt it? Is it working? And I think those are really just fun questions to explore with people, and they're really fun to explore with yourself, right? Like, where do I really care about the outcomes? Where do I really want to do something different? Where do I really have a different idea that I'm willing to put myself out there, and I'm willing to test this idea, and I'm willing to look like an idiot if it doesn't work, and I'm willing to go all in and see if I can do this. And those are the people that we should hold up as heroes, independent of outcome, right? We shouldn't hold up these CEOs of unicorn companies as like, oh, they're just geniuses, and some of them are, no doubt, but we should hold up the heroes as the people that are willing to experiment, the people that are willing to put themselves out there, the people that are willing to do something different, and that's not outcome dependent.
One of the things that I found fascinating about you was that I heard you talk about the real importance that a meditation practice has had. So how could you just sum up your sort of meditation practice and the benefits that it has had on your life?
Yeah. So, I mean, right now I meditate before I go to bed, and after the gym, I usually hop in the sauna and try meditation in there. If there's nobody in there, it works out really well. If there's somebody in there, sometimes it doesn't work as well if they start talking or something. But it sort of like focuses me, right? It grounds me. It gives my brain a break from the stimulus. Like we have all these inputs into our lives, and people I think, are over consuming in a lot of ways. And they're not thinking as much as they should be about what they're consuming, and they're not sort of processing and connecting ideas about what they're consuming. And we consume, but when do we digest? When do we internalize? When do we chew on the information we're consuming? And part of that happens for me through meditation, right? I find it very relaxing and cathartic. And then if I do it before bed, I either fall asleep or like I get this awesome moment of sort of like quiet and stillness and peace in my day, which is consumed by phones and emails and computer screens and light and cars and all of this stimulus coming at me. And I think that it just allows me to sleep better. I notice I sleep better on days where I do it. I notice like I'm more able to think clearly after I've been in the sauna working out and sort of like got this space away from screens. And I think like I often solve problems when I'm meditating or when I'm sort of like in the sauna for whatever reason. I don't know, but like I go to the gym just to go to the sauna now. And I know some people think that's weird, but it's like, hey man, this is like a great 20-25 minutes where I can sort of like get peace and quiet. And for whatever reason, for me, I can just sort of like focus on my breath, and I come up with these approaches that some of them are like asinine, but some of them, you know, we try and they seem to work. But it's just a really good space to clear your brain and start debugging a little bit about what's going on in life sometimes.
Man, that's awesome. Do you have a challenge for us and our audience, Shane? Some homework, perhaps? Well,
I think I already I sort of like prematurely maybe, but I think like one of the things is just asking yourself, like, where are you consciously different from other people? At work, in life, like where are you living your life in a way that is meaningfully different? Like you're not taking an incremental sort of change from somebody else and driving to work in a different way or something. You're sort of like, what am I doing that is going to pay off or not, that I can look like an idiot at? And am I okay with that? And I think the more you're okay with looking like an idiot, the easier it gets to sort of like do these things that are different. And they're not always going to pay off, but when they pay off, they'll pay off really well. You can be your own VC in a way, right? Yeah. Fund all of these sort of like projects, but they're your projects, your mind, and your differences.
Man, that's awesome. Shane, this has been phenomenal. I could speak to you for hours, man. Maybe when your kids graduate from college, we'll do this again. But man, my last question today before we sign off with your socials and whatnot is, let's imagine a scenario in which, man, you make it to 90, right? You get to that age. Perhaps you've got no regrets. I'm not sure. You know, we don't know what's going to happen until then. But hypothetically, you can leave a short but impactful message just before Shane Parrish's time is up. What would your message be?
Live with the end in mind.
Man, that's awesome. Shane, do you want to talk about where our audience can connect with you and the book?
Yeah, I mean, you can go to fs.blog, to the website, join our mailing list. We produce timeless content every week. We sort of like send out the best timeless content that we've scoured all over the internet to find. The book can be found on Amazon.com or Amazon all over the world if you search for The Great Mental Models. On Twitter, it's at Farnham Street or at Shane A. Parrish. And Facebook, we're Farnham Street. Instagram, we're Farnham Street. I think we're sort of like YouTube, where if you search for Farnham Street, we'll come up.
Yeah.
The Knowledge Project would be sort of like the other big thing that we do, where we run a podcast. We get the most incredible people we can think of in the world to sort of give us a few hours of their time. We cover everything from I don't know, conducting an orchestra, to wine tasting, to Daniel Kahneman talking about decisions, and Jim Collins talking about business, and Sue Johnson and Esther Perel talking about relationships, and Barbara Colasero talking about parenting. And the world is this interconnected place, and we just follow curiosity.
Yeah. And I would add a side note to that don't buy an MBA. Listen to the Knowledge Project with Jim Collins.
Oh yeah, I've heard that a lot. Thank you for that. Jim is phenomenal. It's so. In a lot of ways, it's so easy for me to be the host. I just ask questions and shut up, right? And listen to these people go into such depth about what they're thinking and what they've learned and how they've reflected on their experiences to come to the conclusions that they've had. Yeah.
Man, and I have to pay my gratitude to you as well. I'm so sorry about the time, but I just want to quickly add this in, that for me personally, I've taken a lot from you as an interviewer, because I'm not sure how much I'm sure your audience give you massive credit, but the way in which you, I don't know, I just feel as if man, I just don't think there's many around that I listen to anyway, which really dig as deep. That interview with Robert Greene, I think you shocked him how deep you were going.
We get that a lot. Not Robert specifically, but often at some point during the interview, we always edit this out if people say it, but it's this is way more in depth than I'm accustomed to or I thought it was going to be. But what inevitably ends up happening is this huge smile comes on their face, right? Because it's you did your work, you did your research, you care about what I'm saying, and the conversation just becomes so much better in that moment, because it's yeah, we do a ton of work before we sit down with you, and we care about your answers, and we're curious. That's why we reached out to you, and it's not why we don't do a lot of inbound stuff, right? Because we're not necessarily curious about all those people, so the interview would sort of come across flat, right? It would be we can go through the motions on this person or this book that came out, but at the end of the day, we want to be curious about the subject, or I want to be curious about the subject I'm talking about, and I don't think you can sort of fake that. And often people are really taken back from it. James, a friend of mine, James Clear, just did, 250 interviews, I think, in the past year for his book. And he one of his comments was very few interviewers ask different questions. Very few of them have listened to prior interviews or even read the book. And he's it's obvious to me as a guest who those interviewers are. And I think that have respect for your guest, have respect for your audience, right? And if you're respecting your guest and you're respecting your audience, you're going to invest time to do work beforehand, like you, and reading the great mental models, right? You're going to do the work to put yourself in the best position possible to create a really good interview and experience for people. And it might not always work out, but you're putting yourself in the position, right? You're intelligently preparing for a situation.
It was such a pleasure connecting, and,
awesome.
And man, I hope to be in touch in the future when those others are released, and I will definitely be picking up a copy as soon as Amazon.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let me know when it comes out so we can share it.
Sure, man. Shane, thank you so much, sir. It was an absolute pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you so much.